So I just wrapped up the piece that you see behind me, and I've been working on this painting on and off for an entire year. So today I want to tell you a little bit about that process, how it went from reference photo that I took myself to sketch to first attempt, second attempt, and now this third, hopefully final attempt at this painting. I am so excited to share this painting with you. It's been in the works for so long, and I want to give a huge shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and let's get started. So before I talk about the painting, I want to talk about the reference photo. This particular reference photo started this entire journey. I took it myself outside of a little cemetery area while on a road trip with some friends. We were driving up to the Redwoods area of California, and we were getting a little car sick on the drive up, and so we stopped and I took this picture. There's a lot that I love about this picture. I think this particular tree has a lot of character. There's moss growing on this tree to provide even more like kind of textural heterogeneity, and I especially just love the way the branches just kind of arc as they reach upward. I think it's so interesting. I think there's a lot to love and analyze here. Every time I look at this picture, I get the urge to create. And so as soon as I got home from that trip, I almost immediately did a sketch of this tree. For those of you who are going to ask, I'm doing this sketch with a Pentel Graph Gear 700 and drawing on Graphics Duralar matte paper. It's a very smooth, semi-transparent paper, really kind of ideal for things that you want to scan in with minimal texture. Pieces that you want to draft a few times, like composition sketches, comic layouts, even animations. I was considering like making a font using this paper, like kind of traditionally painting a font and then scanning it in. It was working pretty okay, but making a font is actually a lot harder than it seems. Unrelatedly, something really important that I've learned just through putting this video together is how important it is to regularly look at your old work and even try to redo old pieces to really witness firsthand how much you've grown as an artist. It is so easy to get caught up in your own head and beat yourself up over individual mistakes while missing the forest for the trees. The thing that makes a huge difference in your creative practice is your consistency, and also mindful practice where you deliberately try to chase improvement in areas where you're weakest, as well as your ability to reflect and be honest with yourself and really be truthful about where you're at in terms of your progress. I'm still really happy with this sketch for what it's worth. I think there's excellent progress in stylization compared to where I've come from in the past. I think the mark making is really nice and solid and fluid. There's all this craggly texture. I think it has good values, and there are a lot of interesting shapes going on here. But I also think there are some really big issues with this piece too that hindered my ability to turn this sketch into a painting. There are some important things to note here. I was working on a fairly small piece of paper, 9x12, so I wasn't really able to preserve the verticality and that kind of arched nature of the branches that I really loved in the reference. And also, notice how the branches, which are my focus of this piece, this sketch, and the foliage, which is kind of like an afterthought, don't interact basically at all. They exist on separate planes. They are basically never touching, never overlapping. This is fine to do in a sketch, but I think it set me up for disaster in the first iteration of this painting. Okay, this first attempt at this painting is basically an unmitigated dumpster fire. I think it's a total disaster, and there are a few reasons why. Number one, I'm trying a totally new underpainting method in this painting that I end up hating and never using again. I'm doing a huge, like very thick underpainting with a ton of color, not my usual pretty thin wash with very thinned out paint. And then with a clean brush and also like randomly Q-tips, which I learned from another artist, I'm carving away at that like thick underpainting of color for my sketch. So it's a subtractive method, not an additive one. And while I think that's, Jesus. So many sirens. While I think that method is interesting and could totally work for someone that likes sculpture or something, I think it's not for me. I think I get way too focused using my Q-tip and that kind of small little tool on the branches. Yet again, like the sketch, I am too focused on the branches and the anatomy of this tree, kind of forgetting to nail in the overall composition and the big shapes before getting started. Like, I'm not leaning into what I originally loved about the reference photo. I've lost the verticality, like the arched nature of that foliage that drew me to this surface in the first place. Like, the reason that I'm painting this painting on an arched panel is because the tree shape itself reminded me of like an arched top. And I totally lost that in this sketch because I didn't have room for it. Like, I ran out of space on the paper. And then I don't know, I'm treating the sketch as like the ultimate source of truth for the pre-production process for this piece, and forgetting that that sketch has its own flaws despite the fact that I do like it. I don't know, man. It's tricky. Like, I'm looking back on this and I'm thinking to myself, wow, I was just such an idiot. But, you know, we realize that with hindsight, not in the moment. For what it's worth, I abandoned this first attempt pretty quickly. I see a lot of advice online saying that you should use the brush that you feel like is almost too big for the purpose to keep your marks loose. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but personally on this kind of panel, I think a smaller brush would have been more appropriate, and I think I just get too over it and I don't have the color variation that I would have needed to carry that piece. The next version, the second version that you're already seeing, is on a larger arched panel. I think this version is already stronger because I took the time to go full grid method, not my usual 9-dot grid, and spent a ton of time transferring the composition onto this panel. I think it is yet again still too focused on the original sketch, but compared to the disaster of the first one, this one is a lot more solid. The place that I go awry in this version is the color palette. I tried no less than 3 colorways for this painting in this iteration. Each one could have probably worked had I just stuck with it and been willing to figure the problems out, but I wasn't, and I didn't. There's the warm, desaturated, muted, almost desert-y colors, and then a more contrasty version with deeper green foliage and kind of daytime lighting, and then I finally start trying to work in a dusky kind of lighting situation, like very blue hour. But the huge issue here is that I had no clear vision for the piece. The colors were a little bit too strong, like too contrasted. There wasn't enough like similarity in value. I feel like muted colors really enable things to come together and feel more cohesive. Yeah, that's the big honest issue with these two versions. There was no clear vision. There was no single unifying idea for what I wanted to do. At this point, I was really not sure where I wanted to go with this piece. I was really frustrated, so I put it aside and I abandoned it for several months. And then on October 10th, the aurora was visible in California, and I drove out just south of Mount Diablo with some friends and took these pictures. These 20 to 25 second long exposures showed the sky awash in this beautiful pink haze, with the stars shining through it and this gorgeous black, like kind of fuzzy foliage, and it was magical. This is the energy that I wanted that tree painting to have. This is the vibe that I was going for. This magic that I'm seeing here, that's, I think, a little bit of what I wanted to capture but was really struggling with. And so I started the third version of this painting. This process is going to look a little strange because the third and final version of this painting is done on the corpse of the second. I'm using that version of the painting for the drawing and the composition, which I don't entirely hate, and building what I think is a much stronger painting on top of it. The first step in this process is hot pink, hot pink everywhere, hot pink all of the time. It's going to look insanely bright and saturated at first. Don't worry, it'll all make sense at the end because the big idea for this painting is now the aurora, right? That pink wash across the sky with the stars, and I'm kind of carrying that idea into everything else. Because I'm not really adding any blue or purple to the sky, basically, there are a couple of pockets here and there, the reflected light is going to be very pink, right? That ambient light, very warm, very dreamlike, and so I'm carrying that idea into the foreground and the midground of this painting. It's all gonna have a pretty intense red pink kind of lean to it. So I'm starting off with a pretty thin glaze of pink across the entire painting before going in directly with full color. I have a solid plan for this painting and I'm gonna stick with it. And the thing that really helped me with this version of the painting was doing a little bit more of an involved pre-production process. So I put together a few artboards on Photoshop with all of my references. I have the original photo with the aurora photo on top of it via an adjustment layer, and a grid overlaid on top of all of that. I also have the sketch, I have my original aurora photos, and then I have a new artboard with like color-picked colors that I need to mix for this painting and see kind of independent of their contexts. So it's a little tricky for the human brain to really identify what a color actually is because all of the colors around it really change our perception of that color. So by color picking and then putting on a white artboard, I can kind of see things a little more clearly. So with all of that to help me, my main focus is kind of going to be on the sky, right? I'm focusing on getting the gradient that I want, building the aurora up as a subtle arc across the sky. It's going to seem really obvious at first, but I think by the end, unless I had told you, I don't know if you would have noticed. There's a lot of color variation here, a lot of subtle color variations, little shifts in hue. And I think that's important for me to add because the lack of that, the lack of color variation, I think are some of what killed my motivation for the other two versions. Like they lacked that and I felt like it was too blocky and too simplistic as a result. So having that in here is a priority. I mixed a ton of colors. My palette was full. I was out of mixing area. It was rough for there. It was rough for a minute. And a lot of these colors are very rich, a little bit muted though sometimes, and I think people often overlook the value of muted colors as they're starting out as artists and they go for like a ton of saturation. But like again, our experience of color is really dependent on the context that color is in. You can build up this perception of intense saturation via just contrast with duller colors. So this really intense pink that I'm adding, it feels saturated and rich, but also like subtle and a little bit more plausible as aurora and the night sky because like the aurora is like a wash of color. It's like a transparent layer of color across an already dark night sky. And so if it was bright pink at the end in the final version of this painting, that would look a little insane. And that's not what I want. So I think by building this up and having a lot of color variation, it all looks more realistic at the end. And I'm also covering up almost all of the existing foliage in the process of doing this sky because I don't like the foliage in this version. I think it is bad. I think it is not good. Then we start on the midground and the foreground and kind of turning that foliage red. And as I'm placing these colors down, you're gonna think that I'm insane. But you have to trust the process, babe, okay? It's all gonna make sense. These hills are kind of a dull gold in real life, and with the pink ambient light of this intense sky, it's gonna be a pretty warm, dreamy environment. I want you to look at this piece and think like, man, that looks magical. It looks fantastical. But before we get into the home stretch of this piece, I want to briefly tell you a little bit about Squarespace, the sponsor of this video, because I used them to run my website well before I ever gained an audience. Now, Squarespace is really just the perfect all-in-one platform for any artists and entrepreneurs looking to stand out and succeed online. You can sell physical and digital products, an online course, and keep in touch with your fans using their email marketing tools. And I'm going to be honest here, I love designing websites. I redesign mine a couple times a year, and Squarespace makes it so easy to change things up. Their fluid engine system makes designing a beautiful website as easy as dragging and dropping, and I can change the entire color scheme and layout of my website in just a couple of clicks. It's so easy, and their templates are professionally designed and award-winning. Squarespace also has some new features that I'm really excited about. You can now further streamline your site with their new built-in payment processor, Squarespace Payments, giving your customers a more streamlined experience with more ways to pay. And their new invoices feature allows you to send proposals, estimates, and contracts all branded just like your website. Squarespace can truly be a home for everything that you do online. You can go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Kelsey Rodriguez or use my code Kelsey Rodriguez at checkout for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Contrary to this sketch, the focus of this painting is really the foliage and the sky. I wait until the last possible minute to add the branches, and the main reason that I wait so long is really just logistical. Because I spend so much time trying to get the sky just right, and I even do a glaze of a duller red to kind of unify everything before doing a second pass of kind of full thickness paint, it would be a total nightmare to paint around all of the little nooks and crannies of the trunk and the branches. I have seen paintings that do this really well, where people paint around the tree and it looks excellent, but that's not compatible with my patience or the process of this particular piece, I think. As soon as I start adding in the rich darks of the foliage, using that dull red as the underlying color, everything really starts to come together. And having that dark value to kind of ground this piece and really establish the time of day is pretty crucial in really conveying the atmosphere that I want. Process aside for a minute, I really enjoyed making this piece a little more magical than I usually do, a little more fantastical. I'm kind of wondering how I can incorporate little elements of unreality, of fantasy and joy into my work going forward. I think I often look at nature and think about how incredible it is that there's so much diversity on our planet. Trees are a great example of that, a case of convergent evolution. Trees don't all have a common ancestor. Plants just often decide that a tree shape is a good shape to be, that it enables them to reproduce and survive better than other shapes, and so many things just eventually evolved into being what we would consider to fall under this big umbrella category of quote-unquote tree. I get that it happened because there are straightforward evolutionary advantages, etc., but it's also a little magical. It's a little crazy, right? It's a little cool and fun that there are so many different kinds of thing that decided to be tree. And they all have so much character and unique characteristics and fun little textures and cool colors. Man, what a joy it is to be alive on a planet with so much cool stuff to look at and experience. I could spend my entire life trying to see all of the sights and do all of the things, and I would only scratch the surface of what's possible to see. Do you ever think about that? How you're never going to experience all that there is to experience? And that's a little sad, a little disheartening, but also a little incredible. I think it would be sad and, stifling if it was possible to experience everything and see everything. I think that would just be so disappointing. I like that there is stuff that I'll never get to do. Anyway, I didn't see this particular tree that night on October 10th when my friends and I went out to see the aurora here in California, and we saw this beautiful pink wash over the night sky. But I hope that I've done justice to what it could have looked like, what I maybe imagine it to have looked like. None of my pictures are as vibrant or as saturated as this. They're not as painterly, but I think I brought something new to the photo reference. I think I took it in a new direction. I think I added more energy to it, and I'm really satisfied with how this turned out. There are a couple things that I still think that I want to change a little bit. I think I want to add more of a glow even to the tree branches and how they interact with that sky. I think that could be really fun to have like a little halation kind of element to it, but if you are interested in eventually purchasing a print of this piece or keeping up with my work more generally, consider subscribing to my email newsletter, linked in the description. And if you want to see more painting process videos, I did a master study just recently that I think that you'll really love. The video is on the screen right now, and I hope to see you there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.